In the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Julian Briggs had built his life on precision and control. At 34, he owned 3 successful automotive repair shops across Portland, each one a testament to his belief that excellence came from attention to detail and unwavering standards. His hands, scarred from years of working with metal and machinery, could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone or strip down a transmission blindfolded. Julian had learned early that the world rewarded men who could fix things that others couldn't or wouldn't. His father, Moses Briggs, had been a mechanic who drank away his talent and died broke. Julian had sworn he'd never follow that path, building his business through 18-hour days and a reputation for brutal honesty with customers. He'd met Joan Green at a charity auction 5 years ago. She'd been volunteering for a children's organization, her warm smile and apparent devotion to helping kids drawing him like a magnet. Joan was beautiful in an understated way. Auburn hair, green eyes that seemed to sparkle with genuine kindness, and a laugh that made other people want to smile. She worked as a part-time school counselor and spent her free time organizing fundraisers for local children's charities. Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Joan seemed to understand Julian's drive for success while grounding him with her compassion. When she'd become pregnant with Emma, just 6 months after their wedding, Julian had felt his life clicking into perfect alignment. He had a thriving business, a beautiful wife who shared his values, and soon, a daughter to carry on the family name. Emma Briggs was the light of Julian's world. At 5 years old, she had inherited her mother's delicate features but her father's stubborn determination. She could spend hours in his workshop, carefully organizing his tools or helping him work on cars with her own set of toy wrenches. Julian treasured these moments, seeing in Emma the possibility of someone who might understand both his drive for excellence and his capacity for love. The only shadow in Julian's carefully constructed life was the demands of his business. Success required sacrifice, and increasingly, that meant extended trips to evaluate potential new locations or handle complex restoration projects. Joan had been understanding, even encouraging, about these trips. She'd insisted she could handle everything at home, that Emma barely noticed when Daddy was away for a few days. Julian had believed her. Why wouldn't he? Joan was a school counselor trained to work with children. She volunteered with children's charities. Every interaction he'd witnessed between Joan and Emma had seemed loving and appropriate. If anything, Julian sometimes worried that Joan was too soft with Emma, too willing to let their daughter get away with minor misbehavior. This particular business trip to San Francisco had lasted 4 days, longer than usual because the vintage Mustang he'd been restoring had revealed hidden damage that required sourcing rare parts. Julian had called home every evening, and Joan had sounded cheerful and relaxed. Emma had seemed happy during their brief conversations, chattering about her day at kindergarten and asking when Daddy would be home. Julian pulled into his driveway at 6:30 p.m. on a gray October Thursday, the trunk of his BMW loaded with the parts he'd finally tracked down. The house looked normal from the outside, lawn neatly maintained, Joan's Honda Civic in its usual spot, warm light glowing from the kitchen windows. It was the picture of domestic tranquility that Julian had worked so hard to create. He used his key to enter through the front door, calling out as he always did. "I'm home. Where are my girls?" Joan's voice drifted from the living room, carrying an odd note that Julian couldn't immediately identify. "Oh, Julian, you're early. I wasn't expecting you for another hour." Julian set down his travel bag and walked toward the living room, already looking forward to sweeping Emma into his arms and hearing about everything she'd done while he was away. But the scene that greeted him stopped him cold. Emma lay on the couch, her small body unnaturally still, her breathing so shallow that Julian had to look closely to see her chest moving at all. Her usually bright eyes were closed, and there was a grayish pallor to her skin that made Julian's stomach clench with sudden fear. "What's wrong with Emma?" Julian demanded, rushing to the couch. Joan, who had been sitting in the armchair, scrolling through her phone, looked up with an expression of casual annoyance. "She's fine, just tired. She had a bit of a tantrum earlier, so I had to discipline her." Julian knelt beside the couch, his hands hovering over Emma's still form. Her skin was cold to the touch, and when he gently shook her shoulder, she barely responded, just a slight flutter of her eyelids. "Joan, she's not okay. She's barely conscious." Joan laughed, a sound that sent ice through Julian's veins. It was a laugh completely devoid of maternal concern, casual and dismissive. "She was being bad, so I just disciplined her a little. Don't be so dramatic." Julian stared at his wife, seeing a stranger. The warm, caring woman he'd married seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone cold and irritated by his concern for their daughter. "What kind of discipline? What did you do to her?" "Nothing she didn't deserve," Joan replied, returning her attention to her phone. "She was being disrespectful, talking back, making a mess. I told her to go to her room, and she refused. So I made sure she understood that mommy doesn't tolerate defiance." Julian's hands were shaking as he checked Emma's pulse. Too fast, too weak. Her skin was clammy, and when he lifted her eyelid, her pupil's response was sluggish. Every instinct screamed that Emma needed immediate medical attention. "I'm calling 911, Julian said, pulling out his phone. "You're overreacting," Jones said coldly. "She's just sleeping it off. Kids bounce back quickly." But Julian was already dialing, his mind cataloging Emma's symptoms with the same analytical precision he applied to diagnosing mechanical problems. Shallow breathing, weak pulse, unresponsiveness, pallor. These weren't signs of a child who'd been sent to her room. These were signs of a child in medical distress. As he spoke to the 911 dispatcher, Julian watched Joan from the corner of his eye. She wasn't panicking or showing any concern for Emma. Instead, she seemed annoyed by the disruption, sighing dramatically and shaking her head as if Julian was making a fuss over nothing. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, 2 experienced EMTs who moved with practiced efficiency. But as they entered the living room and saw Joan sitting calmly in her chair, something changed in their demeanor. Julian caught the look that passed between them, a recognition that made his blood turn cold. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, began examining Emma while his partner quietly approached Julian. In a voice so low that Joan couldn't hear, he whispered in Julian's ear, "Sir, your wife is someone we've encountered before. Not here, but there are reports. You need to know that what you're seeing isn't normal parental discipline." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. Reports, other incidents, other children. As the paramedics worked to stabilize Emma, loading her onto a stretcher with professional urgency, Julian felt something fundamental shift inside him. The life he'd built, the trust he'd placed, the future he'd envisioned. All of it crumbled in the space of those whispered words. Joan followed them to the hospital, playing the part of the concerned mother for the medical staff. But Julian saw through the performance now. He watched her carefully, noting the moments when she thought no one was looking, seeing the coldness return to her eyes, the irritation that flickered across her face when doctors asked detailed questions about Emma's condition. And Julian Briggs, a man who had built his reputation on fixing things that seemed beyond repair, began to plan how he would fix this permanently. Chapter 2. Uncovering the Truth. The pediatric ICU at Portland General Hospital hummed with the quiet efficiency of life-saving machinery. Emma lay in a small bed, dwarfed by monitors and 4 lines, her breathing finally steady but still too shallow for Julian's peace of mind. Dr. Helena Matthews, the attending physician, had been professionally thorough but carefully neutral in her explanations of Emma's condition. "She's stable now," Dr. Matthews had said, but she came in with signs of acute respiratory depression and mild hypothermia. "We're running additional tests to determine the cause." Julian had pressed for details, but the doctor's responses had been cautious, clinical. It wasn't until Joan stepped out to get coffee that Dr. Matthews returned to Emma's room with a different expression entirely. "Mr. Briggs, I need to speak with you privately," she said, closing the door behind her. Emma's blood work came back. She has traces of diphenhydramine in her system, a significant amount. Diphenhydramine, Benadryl. In large doses, it can cause exactly what you found: respiratory depression, altered consciousness, hypothermia. An adult dose given to a child Emma's size could be very dangerous. Julian felt the floor shift beneath him. You're saying someone gave Emma an overdose of Benadryl? Dr. Matthews nodded grimly. I'm required to report this to Child Protective Services. Mr. Briggs, I need you to understand that this wasn't an accident. The amount in Emma's system suggests deliberate administration of multiple adult doses. As if summoned by the revelation, a CPS caseworker named April Moss arrived within the hour. She was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes that had seen too much, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone who dealt with the worst aspects of human nature daily. Mr. Briggs, we need to discuss some concerns about your wife, April said, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside Emma's bed. This isn't the first time Joan Briggs has come to our attention. The words confirmed Julian's worst fears. What do you mean? April consulted her tablet. Before she was married, Joan Green was investigated twice for suspected child abuse. Once when she was a teacher's aide in Beaverton, and once when she was a nanny for a family in Lake Oswego. Both cases were closed due to insufficient evidence, but the patterns were concerning. What patterns? Children in her care would become mysteriously ill or injured, always when other adults weren't present. Always with explanations that seemed plausible on the surface, but didn't quite add up when examined closely. Julian's hands clenched into fists. Why wasn't I told about this before we got married? The records were sealed when the investigations were closed. And Joan was careful. She never stayed in one position long enough for a clear pattern to emerge. She'd moved to a new job, a new city, a fresh start. Dr. Matthews spoke up. There's something else, Mr. Briggs. Emma has old injuries that weren't mentioned in her medical history. Healed fractures in her ribs, scarring consistent with burns. These injuries occurred over time, probably during periods when you were away on business. The revelation hit Julian like a sledgehammer. While he'd been working to build a better life for his family, Joan had been systematically abusing their daughter. Every business trip, every night he'd worked late, every moment he'd trusted Joan to care for Emma had been an opportunity for violence. There's more, April continued. We've been monitoring Joan's online activity since the investigation began. She's been participating in forums that, well, they've discussed methods of disciplining children that go far beyond normal parenting. Julian's vision blurred with rage. What kind of forums? Groups that believe in extreme physical discipline. Some of the participants share techniques for avoiding detection, for making injuries look accidental, for April paused, studying Julian's face, for making children compliant through fear and pain. Julian stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the hospital parking lot. Below, he could see Joan talking animatedly on her phone, pacing back and forth with an energy that seemed completely inappropriate given their daughter's condition. Mr. Briggs, we're going to need to remove Emma from your home temporarily, April said gently, until we can complete a full investigation. No. Julian's voice was quiet but absolute. Emma stays with me. Joan is the problem, not the home. I understand your position, but April. Julian turned from the window, and something in his expression made the caseworker stop mid-sentence. I own 3 businesses. I have no criminal record, and until today, I had no knowledge of my wife's actions. Emma stays with me, and Joan leaves. That's not a request. April studied Julian's face for a long moment. Mr. Briggs, I need to be clear about something. If Joan is as dangerous as we suspect, removing her from your home won't be simple. People like her don't just accept defeat and walk away. Then we'll have to make sure she doesn't have a choice. Dr. Matthews cleared her throat. Mr. Briggs, there's one more thing you should know. The paramedic who spoke to you earlier, Werner Randall, he asked me to give you this when you were ready. She handed Julian a business card with Werner's personal cell phone number written on the back. Below the number, in neat handwriting, were the words, I know someone who can help. Julian pocketed the card, his mind already working through possibilities. He'd built his business by understanding systems, how they worked, where they broke down, how to fix them when conventional methods failed. Joan Briggs had become a system failure that threatened everything he valued. And Julian Briggs had never met a problem he couldn't solve, given enough time and the right tools. Through the window, he watched Joan end her phone call and head back toward the hospital entrance. She was smiling now, the expression of someone who believed she'd successfully managed a crisis. But Julian could see what she couldn't: security cameras tracking her movement, hospital staff who'd been briefed on the situation, systems already turning against her. Joan Green-Briggs had made her last mistake. She'd hurt Emma for the final time, and Julian was going to make sure she understood exactly what that mistake would cost her. As Emma stirred in her hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open for the first time since Julian had found her, he made a promise that echoed the vows he'd taken when she was born. He would protect her no matter what it took, and he would make sure that the woman who'd masqueraded as her mother paid for every moment of pain she'd inflicted. The game was about to change, and Joan had no idea that she was no longer playing against a trusting husband. She was playing against a man who fixed broken things for a living, and Joan Briggs was about to be permanently repaired. Chapter 3. The Network Emerges. Emma's recovery was swift once the Benadryl was out of her system, but the psychological damage ran deeper than any physical injury. She clung to Julian with desperate intensity, flinching whenever Joan tried to approach her bed. The child's instinctive fear of her own mother told Julian everything he needed to know about the scope of Joan's abuse. "Daddy," Emma whispered during one of the moments when Joan had stepped out, her small hand gripping Julian's finger with surprising strength. "I don't want to go home if Mommy's there." Julian's heart broke and hardened simultaneously. "She won't hurt you anymore, sweetheart. Daddy promises." Warner Randall arrived that evening, officially to check on Emma's condition, but actually to have a very different conversation with Julian. The paramedic was a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst, and his eyes held a knowledge that made Julian pay attention. "Mr. Briggs, we need to talk somewhere private," Warner said quietly. "There are things about your wife that you need to understand." They met in the hospital cafeteria after visiting hours, the nearly empty space providing enough background noise to mask their conversation. Warner carried a thick folder that he placed carefully on the table between them. "Joan Green, or whatever name she was using before, she's not just an abusive parent," Warner began. "She's part of something larger, something organized." Julian opened the folder to find police reports, medical records, and photographs that made his stomach clench. Children with injuries that had been explained away, families that had been destroyed, cases that had been quietly closed or overlooked. "I've been tracking patterns like this for 15 years, Warner continued. "There's a network of people who target families, insert themselves into positions of trust, and then exploit that access. Some do it for money, some for power, and some—" Warner's voice hardened. "Some do it because they enjoy hurting children." The photographs showed children in various states of injury and distress. Some Julian recognized from Joan's charity work, kids she'd claimed to be helping, children she'd had access to through her volunteer positions. The forum that CPS mentioned, Julian said, the pieces clicking together. It's not just about discipline techniques. It's a recruitment and coordination tool. They share techniques for gaining access to children, methods for avoiding detection, and targets for future operations. Warner pulled out his phone and showed Julian a screenshot of a conversation thread. "Look at this." The messages were coded but clear enough to Julian's analytical mind. Joan had been reporting on Emma's schedule, Julian's travel plans, and their family's routines. She'd been sharing detailed information about when Emma would be vulnerable, when Julian would be away, when opportunities for discipline would arise. "There are others involved," Warner continued. "People who help provide cover, who offer alibis, who can make investigations disappear. Your wife isn't working alone." Julian studied the network map that Warner had constructed, seeing connections between Joan and several other individuals in Portland. School officials who had access to children's records, medical professionals who could explain away injuries, even law enforcement contacts who could influence investigations. "Why are you showing me this?" Julian asked. Warner's smile was grim. "Because the system isn't equipped to handle this kind of organized abuse. These people are too smart, too connected, too careful. They've learned how to work within the system's limitations. And you think I should work outside the system? I think you should consider all your options. Werner slid another business card across the table. Moses Kane. He's a private investigator who specializes in cases like this. He's also someone who understands that sometimes justice requires creativity. Julian pocketed the card, his mind already working through possibilities. What do you know about Joan's current activities? She's panicking. Since Emma was hospitalized, she's been making calls to her contacts, trying to coordinate a response. They're planning to discredit you. Claims about your mental state, questions about your fitness as a father, suggestions that you're the one who hurt Emma. The revelation didn't surprise Julian. He'd seen Joan's ability to manipulate perception, to present herself as the victim while destroying others. But now he understood that it wasn't just personal skill. It was training and support from others with the same agenda. There's something else, Werner said, lowering his voice even further. Joan's been grooming Emma for something beyond simple abuse. The network has clients, people who pay for access to children. Emma was being prepared for sale. Julian's hands went very still on the table. The words hit him with the force of a physical blow, but instead of breaking him, they crystallized his resolve into something diamond-hard and unbreakable. I need names, Julian said quietly. Moses can get you everything. Names, locations, financial records, communication logs. But Julian, Werner leaned forward. Once you start down this path, there's no going back. These people destroy lives for a living. They won't hesitate to destroy yours. Julian thought about Emma's small hand gripping his finger, about her whispered fear of going home with Joan, about the terror in her eyes whenever her own mother approached. He thought about the children in the photographs, the families that had been destroyed, the network of predators that had been operating with impunity. They already destroyed my life, Julian said. They just didn't know they were leaving behind someone who could fix what they broke. Werner nodded, understanding passing between them. Moses is expecting your call. But Julian, be very careful who you trust. This network has people everywhere, and they're going to be watching you closely. As Julian returned to Emma's room, he found Joan sitting beside their daughter's bed, stroking Emma's hair with fake tenderness while speaking in a soothing voice that made Julian's skin crawl. Emma lay rigid and silent, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, enduring her mother's touch with the resignation of a child who had learned that resistance only made things worse. "They're my strong girl," Joan was saying. "Mommy's here, and everything's going to be fine. Daddy's just confused right now, but we'll help him understand." Julian watched from the doorway, seeing the performance for what it was, a calculated display designed to maintain Joan's cover while reinforcing her control over Emma. But now Julian could see the predator behind the maternal mask, and he began planning how to remove that mask permanently. Joan Briggs had spent years building a network of people who helped her hurt children. But Julian Briggs was about to build a network of his own, one dedicated to making sure that Joan and her associates never hurt another child again. The war was beginning, and Joan had no idea that she'd just armed her most dangerous enemy with everything he needed to destroy her. Chapter 4. Building the Arsenal. Moses Kane operated from an office above a gun shop in southeast Portland, the kind of place that didn't advertise and required an appointment to visit. Julian found him exactly where Werner had said he'd be, a man in his early 60s with the build of a former boxer and eyes that missed nothing. "Werner told me about your situation," Moses said without preamble, gesturing for Julian to sit in a chair that had seen better decades. "I've been tracking Joan's network for 3 years. She's careful, but not careful enough." Moses spread out files across his desk, surveillance photos, financial records, communication intercepts, and behavioral analyses that painted a picture of methodical evil. Joan's network extended far beyond what Julian had imagined, reaching into schools, hospitals, child services, and law enforcement. The beauty of their system, Moses explained, is that each person only knows their immediate contacts. Joan knows maybe 6 or 7 people directly, and they each know 6 or 7 others. If one person gets caught, they can't bring down the whole network. Julian studied the organizational chart Moses had constructed. But if you target the right people, You can create cascading failures that destroy multiple cells at once. Moses smiled grimly. The trick is identifying the critical nodes and then applying pressure in the right sequence. Moses pulled out a tablet and showed Julian video footage of Joan meeting with various individuals over the past year. A school administrator named Clifford Holmes who had access to student records. A pediatric nurse named Deidre Bentley who could falsify medical reports. A CPS supervisor named Felton Irwin who could influence investigations. Each of these people has weaknesses, Moses continued. Holmes is embezzling from the school district's emergency fund. Bentley has been stealing prescription medications. Irwin has been taking bribes to make cases disappear. You want to use their crimes against them. I want to give you options. Moses leaned back in his chair. The legal system would take years to prosecute these people, assuming they could even build cases that would stick. And while that's happening, more children get hurt. Julian understood the implication. You're talking about vigilante justice. I'm talking about efficiency. These people have declared war on innocent children. I'm suggesting you respond with appropriate force. Moses opened another file, this one containing detailed profiles of Joan's network members. Personal histories, family information, financial vulnerabilities, psychological weak points, everything needed to destroy someone's life methodically and completely. Werner mentioned that Joan's been preparing Emma for sale, Julian said. Moses's expression darkened. There's a buyer lined up, a man named Porter Cannon who runs a private school in California. He's been paying Joan for access to children through her volunteer work, and Emma was going to be the premium offering. Julian's hands clenched involuntarily. Where is he now? San Francisco, but he's planning to visit Portland next week to evaluate the merchandise. Moses watched Julian's reaction carefully. This gives us an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Moses smiled, but it was an expression devoid of warmth. The kind where Porter Cannon never hurts another child, and his death sends a message to everyone else in the network. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Moses laying out a comprehensive plan for dismantling Joan's entire operation. It involved blackmail, extortion, strategic violence, and psychological warfare, tools that the legal system couldn't or wouldn't use, but that would be devastatingly effective against people who relied on secrecy and impunity. There's one more thing you should know, Moses said as their meeting concluded. Joan's been in contact with someone who claims to have information about your business. They're planning to frame you for tax evasion or some other financial crime, something that would destroy your credibility and make it easier to take Emma away from you. Julian wasn't surprised. He'd built his businesses carefully and legally, but he understood that documents could be falsified and accusations could be made that would require expensive legal defense, even if ultimately disproven. Do you know who? Someone with access to financial records and the ability to manipulate them. I'm still tracking down the specifics, but they're moving fast. You probably have a week before they make their move. Julian left Moses's office with a clear understanding of what he was facing and what his options were. Joan's network was sophisticated and dangerous, but it was also vulnerable to someone who understood how to apply pressure in the right places. That evening, Julian returned to the hospital to find Emma awake and alert, her color finally returning to normal. Joan was there too, playing the role of concerned mother for the medical staff, but Julian could see the calculation behind her performance. How's our little girl doing? Julian asked, deliberately using the possessive pronoun to gauge Joan's reaction. Much better, Joan replied smoothly. The doctors say she should be able to come home tomorrow. Julian nodded, but privately he was already making different arrangements. Emma wouldn't be going home with Joan. Not tomorrow, not ever. But Joan didn't need to know that yet. As Julian tucked Emma into her hospital bed that night, she whispered a question that broke his heart. Daddy, why does Mommy hurt me? Because she's sick, sweetheart, Julian replied, his voice gentle but his resolve absolute. But Daddy's going to make sure she can't hurt you anymore. Promise? I promise. And Julian Briggs always kept his promises, no matter what the cost. Outside Emma's room, Joan was on her phone again, speaking in urgent whispers to someone Julian couldn't identify. But thanks to Moses's surveillance equipment, Every word was being recorded, adding to the evidence that would soon destroy Joan's entire world. The network that had protected Joan was about to become her prison, and Julian was going to make sure that every person who had enabled the abuse of his daughter paid a price that would serve as a permanent deterrent to anyone else who might consider harming innocent children. The war had moved from intelligence gathering to active planning. Soon, it would move to execution. Chapter 5. The First Strike. Dr. Helena Matthews signed Emma's discharge papers with obvious reluctance, her professional instincts warring with the legal requirements that she couldn't ignore. Emma was medically stable, and without concrete proof of ongoing abuse, the hospital couldn't justify keeping her longer. Mr. Briggs, I want you to understand that Emma is welcome back here any time, for any reason, Dr. Matthews said quietly. Day or night. No questions asked. Julian understood the coded message. If Emma showed up at the hospital again with suspicious injuries, Dr. Matthews would make sure the investigation was thorough and immediate. Joan had spent the morning performing for CPS caseworker April Moss, presenting herself as a loving mother who was devastated by the accusations against her. She'd volunteered to undergo psychological evaluation, suggested family counseling, and even offered to temporarily reduce her contact with Emma to allow for healing. I just want what's best for my family, Joan had said, tears flowing on cue. If there's been some misunderstanding, some miscommunication, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. Julian watched the performance with cold appreciation for Joan's skill. She was convincing enough that April Moss was clearly having doubts about the severity of the situation. Joan understood that the system was designed to preserve families whenever possible, and she was exploiting that bias masterfully. But Julian had spent the morning implementing the first phase of Moses Kane's plan. Clifford Holmes, the school administrator who'd been helping Joan access children's records, arrived at his office that morning to find federal agents waiting with search warrants. The embezzlement investigation that Moses had triggered through carefully placed evidence would lead to Holmes's arrest by noon, effectively removing him from Joan's network while sending a clear message to the others. Deidre Bentley, the pediatric nurse who'd been falsifying medical reports, discovered that her drug theft had been reported to both the hospital administration and the state nursing board. Her license would be suspended pending investigation, and her access to vulnerable children would be permanently revoked. Felton Irwin, the CPS supervisor who'd been taking bribes, found himself under internal investigation for case tampering. The evidence Moses had gathered would ensure that Irwin was not only fired but criminally prosecuted. Joan received news of these developments through carefully monitored phone calls that Moses's surveillance equipment captured in detail. Julian could hear the panic in her voice as her support network began collapsing, but she maintained her facade in front of the hospital staff. I can't believe Clifford would steal from the school, Joan said to a nurse who'd commented on the news. He seemed like such a dedicated educator. But Julian saw the fear in Joan's eyes, the calculation as she tried to determine how much damage these arrests might cause to her position. She was smart enough to realize that 3 simultaneous investigations of her associates wasn't coincidence. The drive home from the hospital was tense. Emma sat in her car's seat between Julian and Joan, her small body rigid with anxiety. She hadn't spoken since leaving her room, and Julian could see the toll that maintaining her secret had taken on his daughter. Everything's going to be normal now, Joan said brightly, reaching back to pat Emma's knee. Mommy and Daddy are going to take extra special care of you. Emma flinched away from Joan's touch, and Julian saw his wife's mask slip for just a moment, a flash of irritation that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Once they arrived home, Julian implemented the next phase of the plan. While Joan was unpacking Emma's things, he made a phone call to his lawyer, Randolph Petty, initiating divorce proceedings with specific requests for emergency custody based on the medical evidence of Emma's abuse. Julian also activated a comprehensive surveillance system that Moses had installed throughout the house during Emma's hospitalization. Every room now contained hidden cameras and audio recording equipment that would document anything Joan might do to Emma when she thought they were unobserved. I need to run to the shop for a few hours, Julian announced after Emma had been settled in the living room with her favorite toys. There's an emergency with the Henderson restoration. Joan nodded, perhaps too eagerly. That's fine. Emma and I will have some quality time together, won't we, sweetheart? Emma's terrified expression told Julian everything he needed to know. Joan was planning to use this opportunity to re-establish control over their daughter, probably through intimidation and threats that wouldn't leave physical evidence. But Julian didn't actually leave. Instead, he parked around the corner and monitored the house through the surveillance system Moses had provided, watching and recording as Joan's true nature emerged the moment she believed she was unobserved. Within 10 minutes of Julian's supposed departure, Joan's demeanor changed completely. She approached Emma with cold efficiency, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Now listen carefully, you little brat," Joan said, kneeling in front of Emma with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Daddy thinks he's very clever, but he doesn't understand how things really work. You're going to tell him that you made up those stories about Mommy hurting you. You're going to say you were confused and scared and didn't know what you were saying." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Joan's voice became even more menacing. "You will do exactly what Mommy tells you, or the nice men Mommy knows will come and take Daddy away forever. You'll never see him again, and then it will just be you and Mommy won't be nearly as nice as she has been." The threats continued for 20 minutes, escalating in severity and specificity. Joan described in detail what would happen to Emma if she didn't cooperate, painting vivid pictures of abandonment and isolation that were calculated to terrorize a 5-year-old into compliance. Julian recorded every word, his rage building but controlled by the knowledge that this evidence would be crucial in ensuring that Joan never had access to Emma again. But he also understood that Joan's threats represented immediate danger. She was preparing to escalate her abuse now that her network was under attack. The time for passive evidence gathering was over. Julian sent a text message to Moses Kane. "Initiate Phase 2. Target is active." Within an hour, Joan received a phone call that changed everything. Julian couldn't hear the conversation from his position, but he could see Joan's face through the surveillance feed as she received news that made her go pale with shock. Porter Cannon, the buyer who'd been planning to purchase access to Emma, had been found dead in his San Francisco hotel room. The apparent heart attack was actually the result of an untraceable toxin that Moses's contacts had administered during what appeared to be a routine room service delivery. More importantly, Cannon's death had triggered automatic releases of information he'd been holding as insurance against his own network contacts. Federal investigators were now in possession of detailed records of Cannon's activities, including his communications with Joan about Emma. Joan was now facing not just the collapse of her local support network, but federal investigation for child trafficking. The walls were closing in from multiple directions, and she was beginning to understand that someone was orchestrating her destruction with professional precision. Julian watched Joan pace frantically through the house, making increasingly desperate phone calls to contacts who were no longer answering. She was beginning to realize that her carefully constructed life was collapsing, but she still didn't understand who was responsible or how completely they had compromised her position. That evening, when Julian returned from work, he found Joan sitting at the kitchen table with Emma, both of them unnaturally still. Joan's smile was bright but strained, and Emma looked like she was barely breathing. "How are my girls today?" Julian asked, his voice casual despite the rage burning in his chest. "Perfect," Joan replied. "Emma and I had a wonderful talk about honesty and family loyalty. Didn't we, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, but Julian could see the terror in her eyes. Joan had successfully intimidated their daughter into silence, but the surveillance equipment had captured every threat, every manipulation, every moment of psychological abuse. Julian knelt down to Emma's level, his voice gentle but his eyes hard. "Emma, I want you to remember what Daddy told you at the hospital. No matter what anyone else says, Daddy will always protect you. Always." Emma's lower lip trembled, but she managed a small nod. Joan's mask slipped again, just for a moment, and Julian saw the predator calculating her next move. She was trapped, and she knew it, but she was still dangerous. Cornered animals often fought the hardest, and Julian understood that Joan's desperation might drive her to even more extreme measures. But Joan Briggs had made a fundamental miscalculation. She'd assumed that Julian was just another trusting husband who could be manipulated and controlled. She had no idea that she was now facing a man who had access to resources and contacts that operated far outside the legal system's constraints. The network that had protected Joan was gone. Her buyer was dead. Her local support had been eliminated. And Julian Briggs was just getting started. Chapter 6. The Trap Closes. Julian's lawyer, Randolph Petty, called at 7 a.m. with news that accelerated everything. The federal investigation into Porter Cannon's activities has produced evidence directly implicating Joan in child trafficking. FBI agents will be at your house with arrest warrants within the hour. Julian felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by tactical concerns. Will they have enough evidence to make charges stick? Between Cannon's records and the surveillance evidence Moses provided, Joan's looking at federal charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years. But Julian, Randolph's voice carried a warning. Once the FBI is involved, your own activities need to be completely clean. Any evidence of vigilante action could compromise Emma's custody case. Julian understood. Phase 2 of Moses's plan had been successful. Joan's network was destroyed, and she was facing federal prosecution. But Phase 3, the permanent elimination of threats to Emma's safety, would have to wait until the legal system finished its work. Unless Joan gave them a reason to accelerate the timeline. Julian woke Emma early, explaining that they needed to pack a bag for a few days at Grandpa Moses's workshop. Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Julian had seen since the hospital. She loved spending time with Moses, who let her help with his investigations and taught her how to spot hidden cameras. Are we going to stay there? Emma asked hopefully. For a little while, sweetheart. Just until some grown-up things get sorted out. Joan emerged from the bathroom, looking haggard and anxious. She'd clearly been awake most of the night, probably making calls to contacts who were no longer answering. The federal investigation had made her network too dangerous for anyone to risk contact. Where are you going? Joan demanded as she saw Julian packing Emma's clothes. Emma's going to stay with my father for a few days. I think some space would be good for all of us. Joan's facade cracked. You can't take my daughter away from me. Emma isn't going anywhere permanently, Julian said calmly. But given everything that's happened, I think it's best if she stays somewhere she feels completely safe. The word safe hit Joan like a physical blow. She understood the implication, that Emma didn't feel safe in her own home with her own mother. Joan's eyes darted to Emma, who was carefully avoiding looking at her mother while clutching a stuffed animal that had been a gift from Julian. Emma, tell Daddy you want to stay home with Mommy, Joan said, her voice carrying the edge of threat that Julian now recognized. Emma shrank back against Julian's leg, her silence more damning than any accusation. Joan's control finally snapped. You ungrateful little brat. After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed, and this is how you repay me. Julian stepped protectively in front of Emma, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Joan, you need to step back. Right now. But Joan was beyond rational thought. The pressure of the collapsing investigation, the federal charges looming, and the loss of control over Emma had triggered something primal and vicious. She's my daughter, Joan screamed. Mine. I carried her for 9 months. I gave birth to her, and no one is taking her away from me. Joan lunged toward Emma, but Julian was faster. He caught Joan's wrist in a grip that made her wince, his eyes cold as winter steel. You're done, Julian said quietly. You will never touch Emma again. The sound of car doors slamming outside interrupted the confrontation. Through the window, Julian could see federal agents surrounding the house with the precision of a military operation. Joan's face went white as she realized what was happening. FBI, open the door. Julian released Joan's wrist and stepped back, pulling Emma behind him. I'll get the door. Special Agent Isla Wise led the team of 6 agents who entered the house with weapons drawn but not aimed. She was a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent years dealing with the worst crimes against children. Joan Green Briggs, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit child trafficking, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and multiple federal charges related to the exploitation of minors. Joan's mask finally fell away completely. As the agents read her rights and placed her in handcuffs, she turned to Julian with an expression of pure hatred. "You think you've won," she snarled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have friends, connections, people who will make your life hell. Emma will never be safe as long as you're her father." Agent Wise stepped between Joan and Julian. "Ma'am, I advise you to stop talking. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." But Joan was beyond caring about legal consequences. "Tell him about the insurance policy, Isla. Tell him what happens to people who interfere with our work." Agent Wise's expression hardened. "Ma'am, you're making threats against a federal witness. That's an additional felony charge." As the agents led Joan away, she twisted back to look at Emma one last time. "I'll be back, sweetheart. Mommy will always come back for her special little girl." Emma burst into tears, clinging to Julian with desperate strength. He lifted her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and damaged. Agent Wise remained behind after Joan had been taken away. "Mr. Briggs, we need to discuss security concerns. Joan's references to insurance policies and connections aren't idle threats. This network has resources we're still identifying." Julian nodded, understanding that Joan's arrest was just the beginning. "What kind of precautions are we talking about?" "Emma should stay somewhere secure until we can assess the full scope of the threat. These people have shown they're willing to target children to maintain control over their operations." Julian thought about Moses's workshop with its sophisticated security systems and defensible position. "I know somewhere safe." Agent Wise handed Julian her business card. "We'll need extensive interviews with Emma, but we'll work with child psychologists to minimize trauma. In the meantime, if anything unusual happens, anything at all, you call me immediately." As the FBI team finished processing the house as a crime scene, Julian packed more clothes for Emma and gathered important documents. The house that had once represented his vision of family happiness now felt contaminated, tainted by the knowledge of what had happened within its walls. Emma had stopped crying but remained silent, her eyes wide and watchful. Julian recognized the hypervigilant state of a child who had learned that safety was temporary and danger could emerge without warning. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Julian asked as they prepared to leave for Moses's workshop. Emma considered the question seriously. "I think so. But Daddy, what if Mommy comes back?" Julian knelt down to Emma's level, his voice gentle but absolutely certain. "Mommy is never coming back, Emma. Never. Daddy promises." "But she said she would." "Mommy said a lot of things that weren't true. But Daddy always tells you the truth, right?" Emma nodded. "Then trust me when I say that you will never have to be afraid of Mommy again." As they drove away from the house, Julian caught Emma watching it disappear in the rearview mirror. He understood that she was processing the end of one life and the beginning of another, a life where she would be protected by people who genuinely loved her rather than predators who had seen her as prey. But Julian also understood that Joan's threats weren't empty. The network she'd been part of had survived for years by eliminating threats and silencing opposition. Emma's safety would require more than federal protection. It would require the complete elimination of anyone who might seek to harm her. The legal system had Joan in custody, but the war was far from over. Chapter 7. The Gathering Storm. Moses Kane's workshop had been transformed into a fortress. Security cameras monitored every approach. Motion sensors covered the perimeter, and the building's reinforced construction could withstand anything short of military assault. Emma seemed to flourish in the environment, fascinated by the surveillance equipment and comforted by the obvious security measures. "Look, Daddy," Emma said, pointing to a bank of monitors showing different angles of the building's exterior. "Uncle Moses can see everything." Moses smiled at the title Emma had given him. At 62, he'd never had children of his own, but Emma's resilience and intelligence had clearly won his affection. He'd set up a special workstation where she could help with simple investigative tasks, giving her a sense of purpose and control that Julian recognized was crucial for her recovery. Agent Isla Wise arrived that evening with disturbing news. Joan's been making calls from the Federal Detention Center. Somehow she's gotten access to communication channels that shouldn't be available to her. Julian wasn't surprised. Her network had people in law enforcement. Some of them are probably still in place. That's our concern. We've identified 7 current or former federal employees who received payments from accounts linked to Joan's operation. We're moving to arrest them, but in the meantime, Emma remains at significant risk. Agent Wise showed Julian intercepted communications that painted a clear picture of the threat they were facing. Joan's network had activated sleeper cells that had been dormant for years, calling in favors and resources that extended far beyond Portland. There were at least 12 individuals actively working to locate Emma, with instructions to eliminate anyone who tried to protect her. They're treating this as an existential threat to their entire operation, Agent Wise explained. Emma represents the only witness who can directly connect Joan to the systematic abuse, and her testimony could bring down hundreds of people across multiple states. Moses studied the intelligence reports with professional interest. They're using military-style coordination, cell structure, operational security, contingency planning. This isn't some amateur criminal enterprise. Julian felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The legal system, despite its resources and good intentions, was not equipped to handle this level of organized threat. Federal agents could arrest the people they knew about, but they couldn't eliminate people they hadn't identified yet. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Julian asked. Agent Wise's expression was grim. Intelligence suggests they're planning to move within the next 48 hours. They know we're closing in on their network, so they're prioritizing Emma's elimination before we can complete the investigation. That night, after Emma had been tucked into the secure bedroom Moses had prepared for her, Julian sat down with Moses to discuss options that wouldn't be covered in any FBI briefing. The federal investigation is good for prosecuting the people they can catch, Moses said quietly. But it won't stop the people they can't find. Julian understood. You're talking about preemptive action. I'm talking about permanent solutions to permanent problems. Moses opened a secure laptop and showed Julian real-time surveillance of several individuals who were converging on Portland. These are professional killers, Julian. They specialize in eliminating witnesses, and they're very good at making deaths look accidental. The surveillance footage showed men and women who moved with the careful efficiency of people who killed for a living. They were staying in different hotels, using different identities, but Moses's network had tracked their movements and identified their likely target zone. How many? Julian asked. 12 that we've identified. Probably more that we haven't. Moses closed the laptop. The FBI can maybe stop half of them with arrests and surveillance. The other half will adapt and continue the mission. Julian thought about Emma sleeping in the next room, finally feeling safe for the first time in months. He thought about Joan's threats, about the network of predators that had operated with impunity for years, about the children who would continue to be hurt if this threat wasn't permanently eliminated. What are you proposing? Moses' smile was cold. I'm proposing that we solve this problem the way it should be solved. Completely and permanently. That's murder. That's war. They declared it when they started targeting children. We're just choosing to fight back with appropriate force. Julian considered the implications. Once he crossed this line, there would be no going back. He would become something different. Not just a father protecting his daughter, but a man willing to kill to ensure her safety. But Emma's safety was worth any price, any transformation, any moral compromise. Tell me the plan. Moses opened another laptop, this one showing detailed schematics of Portland's infrastructure. They're planning to hit us here, thinking they have us trapped. But this building has advantages they don't know about. Multiple exit routes, defensive positions, and access to the underground tunnel system that connects to the waterfront. The plan Moses outlined was complex but elegant. Instead of waiting for the killers to attack, they would draw them into a trap where they could be eliminated systematically. The building would become a killing ground, designed to give Moses and Julian every advantage while leaving their attackers vulnerable and exposed. What about Emma? She'll be in the most secure part of the building, with multiple escape routes if something goes wrong. But, Julian, Moses met his eyes directly. If we do this, if we eliminate this threat permanently, you need to understand that we're not just protecting Emma. We're sending a message that will protect other children too. Julian understood. Every predator they killed tonight would be one less threat to innocent children. Every network member who died would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar crimes. When do we start? Moses checked his watch. They'll move at dawn. That gives us 6 hours to prepare. As Moses began setting up defensive positions and checking weapons, Julian returned to Emma's room. She was sleeping peacefully, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen since before Joan's arrest. She looked like the innocent child she deserved to be, safe and protected and loved. Julian made a promise to his sleeping daughter, the same kind of promise he'd made when she was born, but with a harder edge now. He would protect her from every threat, eliminate every danger, and ensure that she could grow up without fear. And if that meant becoming something darker than the man he'd been before, then Julian Briggs was ready to pay that price. The men and women coming to kill Emma would discover that they'd made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought they were hunting a frightened father and his daughter. Instead, they were walking into a trap set by people who understood that some fights could only be won through absolute victory. Dawn was coming, and with it, the final battle for Emma's future. Chapter 8, Blood and Steel. Julian had never killed a human being before, but as he watched the first assassin scale the fence surrounding Moses' compound, he felt no hesitation. The man moved with practiced stealth, his black tactical gear, and suppressed rifle marking him as a professional killer sent to murder a 5-year-old girl. Emma was safely secured in the building's panic room, 3 levels underground with its own air supply and communication system. She thought it was an exciting game, playing with the surveillance equipment while Uncle Moses and Daddy worked on important business upstairs. Moses had chosen the building specifically for its defensive advantages. The main floor had multiple choke points that could be controlled by 2 people, while the upper floors provided elevated firing positions with clear fields of fire. The basement levels offered escape routes through tunnels that connected to the Portland Underground. First contact, East Perimeter. Moses whispered into his throat mic, male approximately 6 feet, suppressed rifle, moving toward the loading dock. Julian took position at the second-floor window, his hunting rifle equipped with a scope that Moses had modified for urban combat. The assassin was good. He moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. But he was also predictable, following approaches that Moses had anticipated and prepared for. Julian's shot took the man's center mass, dropping him instantly. The body fell behind a shipping container, invisible from the street, but clearly visible to the surveillance cameras that were recording everything. "One down," Julian reported, surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "2 more coming over the north fence," Moses replied. "I'll take the one on the left." Moses' shot was nearly silent, fired from a rifle that had been extensively modified to reduce both noise and muzzle flash. The assassin dropped without a sound, but his partner immediately went to ground, scanning for the source of the threat. Julian adjusted his position and fired again, his bullet finding its target despite the partial cover. The second assassin fell forward, his rifle clattering against the concrete. "Movement on the west side," Moses said. "Looks like they're trying to use the old truck for cover." Julian shifted to a different window, spotting 3 figures moving in coordinated bounds toward the building. These weren't amateurs. They moved with military precision, using cover effectively and maintaining communication discipline. But Moses had prepared for professional opposition. As the 3 assassins reached the truck, hidden charges detonated underneath it, creating a fireball that eliminated all 3 targets instantly while providing cover for any sounds the explosion might have masked. "That's 6 down," Moses said with satisfaction. "How many more do we expect?" Julian consulted the intelligence reports Agent Wise had provided. "At least 6 more, possibly 8. They'll be more cautious now." "Good. Cautious people make predictable mistakes." The next phase of the attack was more sophisticated. The remaining assassins had clearly realized they were facing prepared opposition, and they approached the building using tactics designed to overwhelm defensive positions through coordinated assault. Julian watched through the scope as 4 figures approached from different angles, moving with the kind of precision that suggested special forces training. These weren't street criminals or amateur killers. They were professionals who specialized in eliminating hard targets. But Moses Kane had been preparing for this kind of fight for 30 years. Initiating area denial, Moses said quietly. Hidden throughout the compound were devices that Moses had constructed from his military engineering background. Improvised claymore mines that could be triggered remotely to clear specific zones of approaching threats. As the 4 assassins reached predetermined positions, Moses activated the devices in sequence. The results were devastating and immediate. 3 of the 4 attackers were eliminated instantly, while the 4th was wounded but still mobile. Julian tracked the wounded assassin through his scope as the man tried to reach cover behind a parked car. The shot was difficult, nearly 200 yards through a chain-link fence, but Julian's hunting experience served him well. The bullet found its target, ending the threat permanently. "That's 10, Julian reported. "Motion sensors show 2 more approaching from the south," Moses said. "These ones are staying back, probably calling for reinforcements." Julian understood the tactical situation. The first wave of assassins had been eliminated, but the survivors would be reporting back to their controllers. More killers will be dispatched, better equipped, and better informed about the defensive capabilities they were facing. How long before backup arrives? Moses checked his surveillance feeds. Based on their communication patterns, I'd estimate 2 hours. Enough time to finish this and relocate Emma to secondary safe house. The final 2 assassins proved to be the most dangerous. Instead of approaching the building directly, they began firing from concealed positions nearly 300 yards away, using high-powered rifles to try to penetrate the building's defenses. Julian felt the building shake as bullets struck the reinforced walls. Moses had prepared for this too. The structure had been reinforced with steel plates and ballistic materials that could stop most rifle rounds. But sustained fire from multiple directions could eventually breach their defenses. "Time to go mobile," Moses said, gathering specialized equipment from a concealed weapons cache. Moses led Julian through the building's tunnel system, emerging from a camouflaged exit nearly 100 yards from the main structure. They now had the advantage of surprise, approaching the assassins from an unexpected direction while the killers focused their attention on the apparently occupied building. The final 2 eliminations were conducted with clinical efficiency. Moses and Julian approached the sniper positions from behind, using suppressed weapons to ensure that no alarm was raised. Both assassins died without knowing they'd been flanked. "That's 12, Moses said, checking his tablet to confirm that no motion sensors showed additional threats. "Area is clear." Julian felt a strange mixture of relief and transformation. In the space of 90 minutes, he'd killed 4 human beings and helped eliminate 8 others. He should have felt horror or revulsion, but instead he felt only satisfaction that the threat to Emma had been permanently removed. "We need to move fast," Moses said. "Law enforcement will respond to the explosions, and we need Emma relocated before they lock down the area." They returned to the building through the tunnel system, finding Emma exactly where they'd left her, safe in the panic room, playing with surveillance equipment, and completely unaware that a war had just been fought for her life. "Did you finish your work, Daddy?" Emma asked as Julian lifted her into his arms. "Yes, sweetheart. We're all done. Now we're going to take a trip to see the ocean." Emma's face lit up with excitement. "Can we build sandcastles?" "We can build whatever you want," Julian promised. As Moses drove them toward the safe house he prepared on the Oregon coast, Julian called Agent Wise to report that the immediate threat had been neutralized. He was careful not to mention specifics. The FBI would find 12 bodies and evidence of sophisticated defensive preparations, but nothing that directly implicated Julian or Moses in wrongdoing. The compound was attacked by unknown assailants, Julian reported. Moses's security systems apparently functioned as designed. "Emma and I are safe and relocating to an undisclosed location." Agent Wise's voice carried obvious relief. "We'll need full debriefings, but I'm glad you're safe." The Portland police are responding to reports of explosions and gunfire. "We'll cooperate fully with any investigation," Julian said. "But right now, my priority is ensuring Emma's continued safety." As they drove through the Oregon countryside toward their new temporary home, Julian reflected on how completely his life had changed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a successful businessman with a seemingly perfect family. Now he was a man who had killed to protect his daughter, allied with people who operated outside the law, forever changed by the discovery of his wife's true nature. But Emma was safe. That was all that mattered. In the rearview mirror, Portland's lights faded into the distance, along with the life Julian had built and the man he used to be. Ahead lay an uncertain future, but one where Emma would be protected by people who understood that some threats could only be answered with absolute force. Jones' network was broken. Their assassins were dead, and Julian Briggs had learned that he was capable of anything necessary to protect the people he loved. Chapter 9: New Foundations. 6 months later, Julian stood on the deck of their new home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching Emma build an elaborate sandcastle with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her. The beach house in Cannon Beach was isolated enough to provide security while giving Emma the normal childhood she deserved. Emma had flourished since leaving Portland. The nightmares had gradually faded, replaced by genuine laughter and the fearless curiosity of a child who finally felt safe. She'd started kindergarten in the local school under a carefully constructed new identity that Moses had arranged, making friends and thriving academically. "Daddy, look," Emma called out, gesturing proudly at her architectural achievement. "It has a moat and everything." Julian walked down to admire her work, noting the strategic placement of defensive walls and the complex water management system she'd incorporated. Even in play, Emma showed signs of the analytical mind she'd inherited from him, combined with an intuitive understanding of protection and security that came from her experiences. "That's incredible, sweetheart. The princess in that castle will be very safe." Emma beamed with pride. "That's the point. Bad people can't get in, but good people always have a way to visit." The simple statement embodied the lesson Emma had learned, that safety and openness weren't mutually exclusive if you were smart about how you managed them. Agent Isla Wise visited once a month to check on Emma's well-being and provide updates on the legal proceedings. Joan had been convicted on federal charges and sentenced to life without parole, her network systematically dismantled through prosecutions that had reached into 12 states. The children who had been victims of the organization were receiving therapy and support, slowly healing from trauma that should never have been inflicted. "The investigation is officially closed," Agent Wise had reported during her last visit. "Every identified member of Jones' network is either in federal custody or confirmed deceased. There are no outstanding threats." The confirmed deceased category included the 12 assassins who had died at Moses's compound, officially listed as victims of unknown assailants during attempted break-in. The Portland police investigation had concluded that the deaths were the result of sophisticated security measures triggered by illegal entry, with no evidence of wrongdoing by the building's occupants. Moses had relocated to a cabin an hour inland, close enough to provide support, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to Emma's location. He visited regularly, bringing Emma gifts that looked like toys but were actually educational tools, puzzles that taught surveillance techniques, games that developed threat assessment skills, books that explained how to recognize danger in disguise. "She's remarkably resilient," Moses had observed during one of their conversations. "But she's also hypervigilant in ways that could become problematic if not properly channeled." Julian understood. Emma's experiences had taught her to watch for threats and assess people's true motivations, skills that would serve her well, but that also carried the risk of preventing her from forming normal relationships. They'd address this through careful exposure to trustworthy adults and supervised interactions with other children, gradually teaching Emma that not everyone was dangerous while maintaining her hard-won understanding that some people were. Julian's businesses had been sold to a competitor, The proceeds invested in legitimate enterprises that could be managed remotely while providing financial security for Emma's future. He discovered a talent for restoring classic boats, work that satisfied his need for precision while allowing him to remain close to Emma. The transformation hadn't been without cost. Julian understood that he was no longer the man he'd been before discovering Joan's true nature. He'd crossed lines that most people never approached, made choices that had permanent consequences, become someone capable of violence in defense of what mattered to him. But Emma was alive, safe, and thriving. That made every choice worthwhile. "Daddy, can we walk to the tide pools?" Emma asked as she put the finishing touches on her sandcastle. "Of course. Let's see what we can find." They spent the afternoon exploring the rocky coastline, Emma delighting in the discovery of sea anemones and hermit crabs, while Julian maintained the casual awareness that had become second nature. He noted the other people on the beach, assessed potential threats, planned escape routes, all while appearing to be nothing more than a father enjoying time with his daughter. That evening, as Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table, Julian's secure phone buzzed with a message from Moses. Package delivered to final destination. Julian understood the coded message. Warner Randall, the paramedic who had first alerted Julian to Joan's true nature, had tracked down the last remaining member of Joan's network, a man who had fled the country but had recently attempted to establish a new operation in Mexico. Moses's contact south of the border had ensured that the man would never threaten another child. Julian deleted the message without responding. Some communications were better left unacknowledged, and some justice was better delivered without fanfare. "Daddy, I finished my math homework," Emma announced. "Can you check it?" Julian reviewed Emma's work, noting her careful attention to detail and logical problem-solving approach. She was already showing signs of intellectual gifts that would serve her well in whatever future she chose. "Perfect, as always," Julian said, pulling Emma into a hug. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Emma. More than anything in the world." As Julian tucked Emma into bed that night, she asked a question that had become part of their evening ritual. "Will you always keep me safe, Daddy?" "Always," Julian replied, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had proven he would kill to keep that promise. "No one will ever hurt you again." Emma smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that her father's promises were unbreakable. Julian stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his daughter sleep peacefully in the bed he'd built for her, in a house he'd chosen for its defensibility, in a life he'd constructed from the ashes of everything he'd believed before. Joan's network was destroyed. Every threat had been eliminated. Emma was safe, happy, and free to become whoever she chose to be. Some storms destroyed everything in their path. Others cleared away the rot and corruption, leaving behind ground where something better could grow. Julian Briggs had weathered the storm and built something better, and he would protect it with the same ruthless efficiency he'd used to eliminate the threats that had nearly destroyed it. The ocean waves crashed against the rocks below, eternal and unchanging, washing clean whatever the tide brought in. Some things could be forgiven and forgotten. Others required permanent solutions. Julian had learned the difference, and Emma would never have to. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.